Yeah, thanks for being at West Point. How long have you been there?
I started here in July of 1992, and I've never looked back.
Holy schmoly.
Yeah,
That's a long career. Now,
that's
were
that's
you,
a lot of graduating classes.
that's a lot of graduating class, no doubt. I'm sure you've seen a lot of changes there. Wow. Well, I want to talk about training Army folks as well as elite athletes because I know it's very different. But first, let's talk a little bit about your background. Where did you grow up? What were some of the formative experiences that got you interested in what you do and led you to West Point?
Sure thing. I'm a refugee from the state of New Jersey, and
Okay.
I attended, starting in the sixth grade, a small private boys' school. Um, and something that I noticed pretty much from the very first day I arrived were all the signs and posters around the school attracting people to the next upcoming game of the soccer team.
Hmm.
And the soccer team was good. And the next year I saw it again, and the team was good. And the next year, and the next year. And it seemed like there was this considerable belief and expectation that the soccer team would be a powerhouse year after year.
Hmm.
And indeed it was. Interestingly enough, the soccer team was the only team at the school that was a powerhouse year
Interesting.
after year after year. And even more interestingly enough, you could take half that soccer team, put them on the basketball court, or put them on the lacrosse field or baseball field. And, again, Mark, this is back in the days when guys played two, three sports,
Right.
um, before modern specialization. But even when you take these guys who are really excellent soccer players, put them in another context, they're only just sort of so-so.
Right.
And it struck me as interesting, curious, somewhat odd that this particular soccer program was so darn good year after year after year, whereas none of the other teams at the school seemed to have that. Um, I didn't understand what was going on for a while, but I learned and I had the experience of being around an institution that had formed a really constructive, self fulfilling prophecy
Right.
about
Interesting.
itself.
Right.
This program fed on its own mystique. The whole school bought into it, and the whole state bought into it. The
Hmm.
coach of that soccer team, a fellow by the name of Miller Bellari, um, one of the greatest soccer coaches that ever lived. Um, I never had the opportunity to play for him because I played football and other sports, but he had succeeded in convincing young kids, seventh grade maybe, that if you were diligent, stuck with the sport, maybe went to a camp in the summer, you had a really good chance of being a starter by the time you were in 11th or 12th grade. And so
Hmm.
he always had a very deep bench, and there was always this positive expectation, this self fulfilling prophecy about success for that soccer team. And I remember vividly one day in the ninth grade, when I'm sitting at the lunch table and I'm telling some of my classmates, we got a lot of talent on the wrestling team coming up. A lot of
Hmm.
guys in our class. I think once we get some seasoning, once we get some good quality competition under our belts, dang it, we're going to be good. And a fellow looked at me from across the table and said, Nate, shut up. You're never going to be any good.
Huh.
Guys at this school don't wrestle well, quote unquote. I'll never
Interesting.
forget those words. He said, we're good in soccer. Sometimes we're good in tennis. Sometimes we're good in swimming. But we've never been good at wrestling and we never will be.
Huh.
Now, on the one hand, the guy was absolutely correct because at the
Right.
time, the wrestling program was pretty much a doormat.
Right.
But I kept thinking, man, who gave him the crystal ball? And it
Right.
was just such a clear example of how people's ideas about themselves, individually and collectively, when we're talking about a team,
Right.
those ideas have a really powerful effect on what actually happens.
That's right.
And I'm really proud to say that in my junior year at that high school, our wrestling team had the first winning season in a long, long, long time.
Right.
We did it again my senior year. I won the independent school state championship. and the team hasn't been a doormat ever since. So that was a really early experience in me understanding, how powerful the mind and how powerful your sense of yourself really is.
Right. That's fascinating. I love that. And the fact that you were kind of self-aware of what was going on at that age, to be able to reflect upon the power of that kind of collective story, both positive and negative, is really
Right.
interesting. So did that experience shape your decision to study psychology
Oh,
and
very
college or
much so.
right?
Very much so. That experience led me to think a lot about the whole psychology of human performance
Hmm.
in the broadest possible context. Um, I went to a small college in Western Massachusetts where I wrote a senior thesis on the psychology of performance, even before the term sports psychology had ever even been coined.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
all my
Interesting.
experiences as a competitive wrestler, as an alpinist, climbing all over the North American continent, studying martial arts from the time I was 14 right up
Hmm.
until today.
Hmm.
All of those performance activities of mine have really been shaped by an interest and an exploration of exactly how your mentality, how your collection of thoughts affects you physically
Hmm.
and influences how you perform.
Hmm. That's fascinating. We have interesting kind of overlaps. Both, but you didn't actually get into. Did you have military experience or no?
None whatsoever. I
Okay.
was hired for this job at West Point um, to be the sort of subject matter expert and source of continuity
Right.
to a program that was started here in 1988 as a very small pilot just to support the Army football team.
Oh, interesting.
A visionary graduate, a bird colonel, combat veteran by the name of Louis Choga,
Hmm.
C S
I
O K
I
A.
know Lewis. I've met
Louis
Lewis. A phenomenal
Lewis,
guy. Yeah, he
yeah,
recently had some health issues. I know, so he's not able to continue his work. But he had a stroke recently. But yeah,
yeah.
Lewis. What
Lewis
an
was the guy who had this blinding flash of the obvious. He
right.
said, "Come on, we are preparing cadets for potentially the most stressful human activity possible, ground combat.
Right.
We ought to really look at the intangibles of what creates or enables success in that context.
Hmm.
We're going to get them physically fit, we're going to get them the best equipment possible, we're going to teach them all about geography and engineering. Maybe we ought to be teaching them a little bit about confidence, focus, composure under pressure. Can we actually come up with a curriculum that'll help our cadets understand those things?" He came up with a skeletal program in 1988, began to pilot it. It flourished here at West Point, and late in 1991, he put out a search for a civilian subject matter expert with a lot of applied experience. And I ended up with the job, and I've been here ever since.
That's awesome. Yeah, Lewis was quite a pioneer. And speaking of pioneers, you talk about sports psychology being kind of nascent in the late 70s, early 80s. But I had a swim coach at Colgate named Bob Benson who had me visualize my race with a stopwatch.
Yeah.
And so he was like putting himself out there. That was really early in the day before there was any real chatter about the power of practice visualization. And I've told this story before. It had a profound effect on me. Like literally, I had a lot, I had to trust him because as you know, it's really hard to do that, especially, to swim an entire race in your head, with your eyes closed. It took me months and months before I could actually concentrate deep enough to do that. But when I finally was able to do that, my time kind of settled in at the same time every time I would do it, roughly, within a few hundredths of a second. And it was always 3 seconds faster than I'd ever swum in my life.
Hmm.
And the way the story goes, and I'll be really brief here, is that was my sophomore year. And then junior fall, I did one of those overseas study groups. So I didn't swim that year. I was kind of off the team because I was overseas. And I came back in the spring and they were finishing up the season. And I ran into the coach and he's like, "Hey, Mark, blah, blah, blah. How was your trip? Oh, by the way, we've got our championship race coming up next weekend. You want to get in the pool?" And my head's going, nodding yes. And my mind is saying, I don't want to do that. Of course. But there I was standing on the block, and I jumped in for the 200-meter breaststroke, and I was like, oh my God, I feel like I'd swum this race before, and I got that time that I'd visualized a full year
Uh,
before.
that
Isn't
doesn't
that cool?
surprise me in the least.
Right?
Um, Great coaches have always understood this.
Right?
Whether they wrote books or conducted research on it, the great coaches have always known about how powerful the mind is and how you have to leverage it. Um, I had a great experience very similar to that, mentoring the first cadet to run a sub 4 minute mile.
No kidding.
Yep,
Interesting. Wow.
that fella Dan Brown, who just retired as an '05. He coached in the Army's World Class Athlete program for a
Hmm.
while. He ran the 10,000 meters and the marathon in the 2004 Olympic Games. But in February of 1997, he became the first cadet to run a sub 4 minute mile,
Wow.
and he and I had worked together lots prior to that, and he sat in one of our special ergonomically designed recliners, and we would go to the field house in his imagination, picturing in vivid detail some of his warm-ups, some of the sights and sounds of that particular meet that was coming up in 2 days. This was on
Hmm.
a Thursday,
Hmm.
and we took a very detailed visualization right up to the starting line. We had a simulation of a starting gun go,
Oh,
hit the
cool.
stopwatch, and he ran that sub 4 minute mile. He ran like 3:58 something in his imagination, hitting every split that he wanted to hit. 2 days later, he runs about 4 or 5, maybe 4/10 of a second slower, but it was still the first 4 minute, sub 4 minute mile in Academy history, and that record still stands today. By the way, um,
That's
I'm
amazing.
grooming his successor to
Are you?
run a little
Yes.
faster, but the idea of you can visualize an outcome that you want, and your nervous system gets adjusted to it. So
Right.
when you're there in the moment, there's still a sense of excitement,
Right.
but there's a sense of certainty about it as well,
Right. I love that
because
you use that
it's
word.
happened before.
Yeah. That word I've used often, because I had another similar experience where instead of visualizing an athletic event, I visualized myself um, basically going through SEAL training and
Yeah,
graduating. And this is, again, we're talking about, I joined the SEALs in Navy in 1989. So after a 4-year career as a CPA, getting my MBA at NYU, but that's when I started the martial artist. So I'm a martial artist as well, to continue, continuing to this day. And I got involved in a traditional karate program with a Zen master, a Grand Master who was also a Zen master, the founder of the school called Seido Karate. So it's Nakamura. And so through this practice of Zen, um, it kind of opened me up. And there's a huge story as I literally as to what happened to me, but I chose a whole different path in life as a result of that. And so when I chose to go into the SEALs, I still hadn't been accepted yet, and I was a civilian, right? So there's only for the SEALs, there's only like one or two people they take out of the civilian world through OCS to become a SEAL. It was very hard to get into, and my recruiter was saying, "Don't get your hopes up." But I remembered that experience with Benson and visualization
hmm
for swimming, and I said, "Well, I wonder if this works for other things." And so after my meditation every morning, I would visualize myself as best I could going through SEAL training and just like kicking ass.
yeah,
And the only kind of grist I had was the recruiting video called "Be Someone Special," and I just watched that about 10 times, and then I kind of inserted myself into the video. But anyways, back to the certainty, and I wanted to kind of ask this as a question. It's not a fast process. Like this took months and months and months of work. And I would say around 9 months, I had this shift in my psychology where suddenly I didn't hope to be a Navy SEAL or desired a Navy SEAL. I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was going to be a Navy SEAL. I had 100% certainty. And it was that week that that shift came across me, that the recruiter called and said, "Hey, Mark, congratulations. You're one of two guys who were selected this year." And then when I went to SEAL training, similar to experience like when I jumped off the blocks into the pool. I was like, this feels really familiar.
This feels familiar. Even
It
though you
feels
have
familiar.
never been there,
Right.
it felt familiar
That's right.
because your nervous system had spent so many hours
Right. Practicing it,
practicing that.
being it.
The same neural circuits that you needed to employ once you got to Coronado Beach or wherever that you
Right.
guys were doing your training,
Right.
those same neural circuits that you exercised there in the actual environment, you had already been exercising them
Right.
in the theater of your own imagination.
Right.
I'm sure many of your listeners are aware of this, but it bears repeating. Our human nervous system, in so many important ways, does not distinguish between something that we actually experience and something that we vividly imagine experiencing.
Right.
And so the implications of that are vast. If you
Extraordinary.
want to be comfortable playing a piano recital in Carnegie Hall, it's very, very advisable for you to get a whole lot of photos of what that place looks like and be
Hmm.
able to insert yourself, just as you described,
Hmm.
insert yourself into those pictures. Feel the glare of those particular lights. Sense what the floor looks like. Sense what you might be seeing as you walk out onto that stage, sit at that piano stool, take your breath,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
begin to play. And then feel your fingers on the keys, feel the
Hmm.
emotional content of the music, hear the precise tones coming out of that Steinway or whatever you're playing. That process can benefit anyone in
That's
pretty
right.
much any human performance activity.
Yeah, it's difficult work though, and especially the way you describe that is so interesting because for it to be effective, it's got to be a multisensory, enriched, embodied experience, right? And so
Yeah.
most people don't use their minds that way. So how do you train a cadet or a new athlete? How do you take them from zero to what you just described? A full sensory, envisioned experience as if you were there in person.
Well, I start with something really simple and then work up to complicated scenarios. The simplest thing that I can do, um, gosh, just imagine that you're sitting at your kitchen table and you have a nice ripe lemon in front of you on a plate with a nice sharp knife, and you cut into that lemon, and you feel the weight of the lemon in your hand, and you feel the texture of it, and you can see the way the light glistens off the cut surface, and you
Hmm.
bring it up to your face and you can smell that lemony, citrusy aroma, and you may just take a little tentative like lick at it, and then a little careful bite, and you can taste the juice. And now you imagine taking a great big mouthful of it and chewing it up and really feeling it in your mouth and just doing simple things like that.
Yeah.
Tell me, Mark, is your mouth watering right now?
Yeah, yeah. No, I just ate a lemon. It's
You
delicious.
just ate a lemon. No, you didn't eat a lemon, but your nervous system, the taste buds in your tongue were activated. They sent a message back, to your cortex. Your cortex sent messages to your sublingual glands to start producing saliva. You
Hmm.
know, all in the absence of anything that was real. It was just your imagination
Right.
literally changing your biology. So
Right.
you were doing that to prepare your biology to swim a really good 200-meter breaststroke. You were
Right.
preparing your biology, to do the swim tasks, to do the lifting tasks, to do the runs, the push-ups, et cetera, at SEAL training. We're doing the same things here with athletes, with firefighters, and with cadets who are doing things like preparing to interview for a Marshall Scholarship or a
Hmm.
Rhodes Scholarship.
Hmm.
All your listeners out there who are entrepreneurs assembling a team, bringing a product to market, this kind of detailed envisioning can pay huge dividends. So,
Right.
but to get back to your question, you have to start with something small,
Right.
okay, and be able to create a multisensory representation of it, and then you can move on to bigger things.
Right.
I
So
have guys do visualizations, about a football, if that's their game, being able to see the texture of the leather and the exact contour of the laces and feel it in their hands and move it around. And then can you imagine that you are now on a field and you're holding that ball, but you can feel the turf under your feet, and you
Mm.
look around and okay, there's the goalpost, there's the scoreboard. Now let's imagine there's one other member of my team, and I'm just throwing a really simple, 15-yard out pattern. You can build up, build up, build up endless layers of complexity, just
Right.
starting from those simple things.
Do you guide the visualizations for your athletes, or do you have them kind of do it themselves?
um, there's a mixture.
Right.
At times I have to guide them, you know, especially in cases when we want to make sure that we are preparing for certain situations
Right.
or that we are rehearsing particular skills. A lacrosse player trying to learn a particular dodge and get a shot off to a particular part of the goal.
Hmm.
If that's a goal of hers that she wants to achieve and improve that skill, well then I will guide that visualization exactly, narrating it, and then let her take it over.
Hmm.
Later on, as people become more sophisticated, boy, I can sit them down, I can do a little deep breathing, we can relax into a nice easy quasi meditative state, and then all I have to say is, you're on the field.
Right.
It's the fourth quarter, ball starting at our 15-yard line. We need a touchdown.
Hmm.
There's no field goal option. Run the offense. See the sequence. Let me know when you're standing in the end zone celebrating that touchdown, and they
Hmm.
can just run with it and go with it and produce all those wonderful pictures.
Oh, that's cool. So I can see how, you know, um, stimulating and training your nervous system for the win in advance has a big effect on one's self confidence, which is the title of, or, the topic of your book. What other things do you work with? What other tools or parts of an individual's psychology do you work with to improve confidence?
Um, I start out typically making sure that people get a good handle on their memories,
Hmm.
managing the memories that you have of yourself in a particular performance situation or with regard to your given profession. Um, those long-term memories. What are the most successful moments you've ever had? Or what are the seminal moments that really established you as someone who might be really good at a
Right.
sport or a musical instrument or a particular academic subject? And then I conduct people and advise them to do a daily, fairly in depth reflection of their experience of the day, journaling,
Hmm.
deliberately journaling an episode of success, an
Hmm.
episode of effort, an
Hmm.
episode of progress. And in this way, we sort of assemble a collection of encouraging, optimistic thoughts about ourselves
Right.
by deliberately selecting out the right kinds of memories.
Right. I
That's
love that.
that.
So,
That's a process that anybody can do. It doesn't take a lot of time. You just
right.
got to understand, a few principles and the value.
Yeah, and the corollary outcome to that is you're training your mind to look for the good things as opposed to being dwelling on the bad, or the negative or the suboptimal. And so many people dwell on the failures or the things that didn't go well, and unfortunately that just greases the groove of that negative conditioning. Right.
Exactly. You're greasing the wrong kind of groove.
Right.
So I encourage people to take a very active, selective, deliberate role in managing their memories.
Hmm.
And I counsel people to take an active, deliberate role in telling themselves stories about themselves in terms of, I have this quality, I
Right.
have this skill level, I am achieving a given outcome. The sort of affirmational process that
Right.
is very specific and very detailed, rather than just looking yourself in the mirror and saying, oh, every day I'm getting better looking. Okay,
Better and
no,
better. Yeah.
every day, every day my footwork from the baseline to the top of the paint gets more precise.
Hmm.
My shooting mechanics are quick and precise.
Hmm.
My defensive presence on the field is felt by all my teammates. Really getting people to tell stories to themselves about themselves, which are empowering and which subtly but significantly force them to take the right actions to become what they tell themselves that they are.
Right.
And this
Why do
goes
you?
again right back to that soccer team.
Right. Yeah,
You're
the
going to tell
stories.
yourself, we're a powerhouse, which means you're going to practice like a powerhouse player. It's very interesting the way that relationship works.
That's fascinating. It's so true that we are just a collection of stories individually and as a team or a community, and that we can architect those stories. And that's the key. It's like brilliant, successful people have figured this out throughout the centuries. And it's just like architect the story that you want to live, and then that story will show up, right?
Hmm.
You got to take action, of course, but the action is built upon the thought. I have back to imagery and self-talk. Why do
Yeah.
you think it's important that when we're doing this work, we talk to ourselves as if we've already accomplished it, as opposed to in a sense of like it's still out there and I'm grasping for it, or I'm reaching for it, or I desire it?
When you affirm something in the present tense, it just becomes more immediate. It
Right.
just becomes more palpable. Um, I'm sure it accesses a deeper level of neurology
Hmm.
when you think, you know, my feet are in perfect rhythm as I round that turn for the
Hmm.
400 meters,
Hmm.
as opposed to my feet will be.
Right.
There's a very different level of physical immediacy that comes when you phrase it in the present tense.
Interesting. Yeah. It's a subtle difference, but it makes a big difference in the outcome. Yeah. When do you work with non-athlete cadets, like the general population to prepare
Absolutely,
them for combat?
absolutely. Well,
Okay.
let's be fair. Every cadet is an athlete. Okay,
Okay. A warrior
every
athlete. Yeah.
every cadet at West Point is training to be a tactical athlete,
Right.
and
Got
we
that.
have, as you're well aware, pretty strict physical requirements. We
Hmm.
have physical fitness testing twice a year. We have a mandatory indoor obstacle course test that you must take every year.
Hmm.
We have a mandatory survival swimming class, mandatory combatives, mandatory boxing.
Hmm.
Um, every cadet is indeed an athlete. Some of those cadets struggle a little bit with some of those requirements.
Hmm.
Some of our cadets struggle with the academic grind of West Point.
Hmm.
But these same mental skills that we employ for the cadets who you're going to see participating in the Army Navy football game every year in December on television, those same techniques are of value to the cadet who was looking to maybe be the have the highest fitness test score in his or her company, or the cadet who wants to ensure that they're going to get an acceptance to medical school upon graduation
Hmm.
because their vision, their desired goal is to become an orthopedic surgeon for the Army.
Hmm.
So all of the skills are applicable across the board to all cadet performance endeavors, and I spend just about as much time with non varsity athlete cadets as my program does with our football, basketball, baseball, wrestling, lacrosse, rugby, swimming, etc., etc., etc.
Hmm. How does that work? I mean, you can't obviously can't work one on one with everybody at the school. Um,
We have a we have a 10-lesson mental skills for cadet success course.
hmm.
We are embedded, my staff and I are embedded with various teams so we can do some collective training. We will do workshops for cadets in different performance situations like the survival swimming class.
Hmm.
So we do try to scale it up as best we can.
Got it. So far we've talked about imagery work and self-talk. What other tools? What other powerful tools do you use with the? I mean, I know those are kind of like the most probably potent. You got to get those right. But what else works? That
Well,
was effective.
I think you got to have a certain perspective.
Hmm.
I think some of the skills of regulating your self talk are based upon some understandings about the function of the
Hmm.
mind body connection, the fact of simple human imperfection, and being able to deal with that without a great loss of
Hmm.
energy and enthusiasm for yourself. I spent an hour just about 2 hours ago with the cadet educating him about how to deal with the negative self talk and how to interpret his own imperfections in competition, you know,
Hmm.
instead of having something go wrong and that voice in his head and immediately jumps to, uh-oh, here we go again, I'm in trouble. No, being able to interpret that mistake, that imperfection, just as a temporary process.
Right.
It happened, but it just happened then in time. It happened just there in place. And no, it's not the definitive statement about how good a player he is.
Right.
So you have to kind of leave those mistakes as temporary, limited, and really representative of who you are. And
Right.
it's getting people to accept the fact that they have a choice to make about how they view themselves in moments of competition. And once you understand those principles, and as you say, you practice them, you practice them, you practice them, man, eventually it gets into your neurology and it becomes natural for you to rise above or not be dragged down by the difficulties that we all face and
Hmm.
by the inevitable imperfections that we all commit at times.
Right. That's great. So that speaks to kind of like the emotional aspect of self confidence, right? Like I said earlier, we can, you can be a great athlete and have all the skills dialed in and still torpedo your own success, at the 1 yard line because of some
Yeah.
emotional shadow issue or trauma that's unresolved.
Or perhaps just simply because you're wondering, okay, hey, we didn't get a whole lot of reps on this goal line.
Right.
Um, I wish we had practiced it more, you
Yes.
know,
Not
instead of
having that,
saying,
that
okay,
certain,
well, we got the reps we got, and those reps are enough.
that's right.
We're putting it in. Being able to say to yourself, I am enough for this moment, even if you really gave it a whole lot of sober reflection, you can come to the conclusion that we really didn't practice this a whole lot. But I have no choice but to be certain about it in the moment. You know,
Right.
um, we'd all love to have the perfect level of preparation. We'd all
Hmm.
love to have enough opportunities to study for that upcoming exam and make sure that we had enough time to cover every chapter and every possible detail so we could walk into that exam feeling like, hey, I really know this subject matter. We don't always get that time,
Hmm.
but you can't use the fact that, hey, I didn't have a whole lot of time to study as an excuse to walk into that exam room um, shaking in your boots.
Hmm.
You got no choice if you actually care about doing well but to
Right.
say to yourself, okay, I studied what I studied, I know what I know, I'm going to let out everything I know. Let's see if this professor can stump me. And it's coming into it with that kind of borderline cockiness that I think is really valuable. And our schooling system tends not to teach that.
Right.
And our whole society is very ambivalent about confidence. Yeah, we know you got to have some, but you better not have too much, kid. You better not think too highly of yourself. And our cadets and our society at large is drilled with those sorts of messages. So there's plenty of work for me to do to straighten folks out.
Yeah. No, I'm definitely certain of that. I've heard stories from the SEAL instructors, dealing with youth of today as they come in and they have. It's interesting. They have low confidence with an attitude,
Mm-hmm.
which is a strange combination, right?
Very strange, yeah.
Yeah. So you got to unwind